Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Suzanne Walker. I'm the supervisor for the Indiana State Library's Professional Development Office. Thank you guys so much for joining us for today's webinar. We are so pleased to have Andrea Morrison and Thomas Whitaker from the Herman B. Wells Library at IU Bloomington here today to talk to us about descriptive cataloging for books and DVDs. What is the title? I know sometimes that is tricky. So I'm going to start the webinar off with a couple of announcements. The state library has many ways that we try to stay connected to library staff across the state. For weekly updates on upcoming trainings and to learn more about what's happening in libraries across the state, please subscribe to our weekly e-newsletter, The Wednesday Word. We also offer a blog which provides information about Indiana State Library's collections, interview spotlights on library staff from across the state, and information about upcoming events at the Indiana State Library. If you are having any sound issues during the webinar, take a look at the Audio Setup Wizard sound issues box that's directly below your chat box. If there is a global sound issue, we will announce it in the chat box. If you're unable to resolve a local sound issue that you might be experiencing, don't forget that we are recording this meeting. You can certainly watch it offline after the meeting has ended. Again, if there's a global sound issue, we'll make an announcement, and at this time we are not experiencing any global sound issues. So today's webinar will be archived and available to access and share on the Indiana State Library's archive training page. I am a little behind on archiving my webinars, so it might take a little bit of time to get this one up. However, if you would like the recording directly after the webinar, feel free to let us know and we can send you the link that is not transcribed, but we'd be happy to send that to you. Also, I wanted to let you know that your LEU certificate for attending today's webinar will be available as a download at the end of the webinar. And I also wanted to mention that our new trainings for 2018, we are going to announce those next week, I think next week. So you'll at least get a sense of some of the webinars that are coming for 2018. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Andrea and Thomas. And welcome, Andrea and Thomas.
Thank you so much. Welcome to Descriptive Cataloging for Books and DVDs. What is the title? And my name is Andrea Morrison, and I'm here with my colleague,
Thomas Whitaker. I'm the head of media cataloging here at IU Bloomington Wells Library.
And I'm the head of monographic text cataloging. And we're both in technical services at Indiana University Libraries in Bloomington. We wanted to give you what the sound of our voices sound like because we will be sharing, explaining the slides to you. Here are the topics we are going to cover today. So cataloging sources, variant title definitions, instructions, and sources of information. We'll have some basic examples of variant titles. We also have a handout that we can share with a link afterwards that gives you some of those definitions. We have some special scenarios. Those include things like franchise titles, special designs. We also will cover alternative titles, parallel titles, collective titles, manifestation lacking a collective title, and we'll mention devised title. So here are some cataloging sources that you may or may not already be using. So the basic cataloging instructions that a lot of us are using, unless we use specialized instructions, is RDA, Resource Description and Access, which was implemented in 2013. The Library of Congress, LC, Program for Cooperative Cataloging, PCC, policy statements on those instructions are available free in the RDA toolkit, which is published by the American Library Association. And later we'll show you some of those access instructions because they are great for titles and variant titles. The actual policy statement, LCPCCPS, that has a lot of great examples, is 2.3.6.3. And we'll also cover a little bit about MARC fields 246 and 740, but we did promise to show you some OPAC views as well as MARC views, so don't worry, we'll do that. So the policy statements covers both showing you the MARC fields, but also when you might want to add variant titles for permutations related to the title proper and other titles borne by the item, for example, cover title. And then Thomas will cover best cataloging practices from OLAC and other communities. And we'll show you a little bit about from standards that will help you for inputting into OCLC bib formats and standards. And I've linked field 246 and 740 there. These links will be available through our slides, which will be freely available to you, as well as our handout. The handout is called Types of Titles. Also, we wanted to remind you that MARC 21 format for bibliographic data is available.
So as Andrea mentioned, I'm going to talk about some OLAC best practices. OLAC is the Online Audiovisual Catalogers. If you're not familiar with OLAC and you do any type of audiovisual or media cataloging, I would strongly suggest that you visit their site. And also, if you don't mind receiving emails once in a while, log on and get connected to their listserv, especially if it's a situation where you may only catalog media every once in a while and you have questions. The community there at the listserv is very responsive and helpful for folks. But the best practices guide for cataloging DVD, video, and Blu-ray discs using RDA and MARC 21 is a picture of the title page there on the left. And also I want to briefly mention that while we're not going to be covering authorized access points for works in this webinar, there is an LC-PCC policy statement that pertains to constructing authorized access points for motion pictures, television programs, and radio programs that is immensely helpful. And the link for that instruction is there on the right.
So here are a few variant title definitions. In RDA, the definition is a title associated with a resource that differs from a title recorded as a title proper. Also, a parallel title proper and other title information, a parallel other title information, an earlier title proper, a later title proper, a key title, or an abbreviated title. Have you ever found that it's sometimes difficult to figure out what is the title? What source should you use? Well, chiefly we look for a title page or a cover title in books and monographs, but sometimes it can be a source that has more information if the title page has a brief title and the colophon has another title. So how do we deal with improved access? We add variant titles. So variant titles include those that appear in the manifestation. They're associated with the manifestation through reference sources, and these can be popular names, assigned by a cataloging agency. They're device titles for collections. They're corrected titles, part of title, and other variations in the title proper or other title. And hopefully our examples will help you be less confused. So where do you get the sources of information for a variant title? Well, first of all, as I said, you have to decide what your title page is. And then you record the variant title from any source from within the resource itself that you're cataloging and from outside the source, and then using your own judgment, especially for permutations or variations of a title, to expand an ampersand or to give an alternate for a symbol, for example. Now, for sources of information for the policy statements and DVDs, again, this policy statement is an excellent source of variant title examples and for books as well as motion pictures, etc. And a variant title should also always be considered important for identification or access. Now, what that means is it should be important to you. So add a variant if you feel it's important. We have a few examples. And for DVDs, Thomas reminds us always to have a variant title from the container when it differs from the title proper. Now, I don't always do that with a cover title if I feel it's not important for identification and access. Here are the actual instructions from RDA. Record a variant title that is considered important for identification or access by applying the basic instructions on recording titles at RDA 2.3.1, and make a note on the source or basis for a variant title if considered important for identification or access. Now we'll show you some pictures. So here's an OPAC view and here's a MARC view for form and function. And this is a cover title, but the title page is exactly the same. And so you notice that we have to transcribe the ampersand, right? So best practices is to always give a variant title then if we are transcribing the title proper as form ampersand function. And then here's a good example also of when you might want to record a portion of title. And we'll show you other examples later for that. But for form and function, the typical cataloging practice is to add a 246 field, 3.0 for portion of title, form, and the word and function, and not to give the other title. However, I have given this in an or because if in your catalog it works better to give the other title, you may do so. That can be your local practice. And the instruction is make a variant title for a portion of a title proper when it is judged that some users would consider the portion as the title proper. And here's a typical example of portion of title. Again, the title page looks very much like this cover. The cover had some nice pictures, so that's why you have it here. Civil War London. Well, that could cover a pretty broad time period, right? But the other title is A Military History of London under Charles I and Oliver Cromwell. So an OPAC title and variant title, and in MARC, the best practice is 246.30. Now, have I seen this missing from records? Absolutely. It's not required. It is not core to do this. It's a cataloger's judgment to add this variant. But I feel that Civil War London is so it's vague, and I feel that our users would be helped by transcribing this portion of title. And transcribing another title, so the remainder of the title, what we in catalog or transcribe after in field 245, subfield B, that is probably the most typical portion of title that's transcribed in field 246.30, but it is not the only type of portion of title you can transcribe. So here's an example, and this would be entirely up to you. So here's a pocket guide to Indiana sportfish identification. And notice sportfish is very big in design, right? Well, I would not give sportfish as a portion of title, but here's some possible variants. No variant, you just don't feel it's important. Or give a variant for Indiana sportfish identification, because if someone is looking up sportfish in your catalog, they probably want sportfish in Indiana. Maybe not. And then, since sportfish is the design that's big in this title, then maybe you want to give sportfish identification as a portion of title. And Indiana sportfish identification or just sportfish identification would both be appropriate in a 246.30 field. You could add one or both. It's your judgment. You decide what's useful for your users. Now this one is a little bit more difficult. So here is a government publication from the Weather Service, NOAA. It has an acronym in it, NOAA, and it is celebrating 200 years of science, service, and stewardship as part of the title. Now this cataloging record, this example, which I've actually linked the ebook, is a cover title. So the title source of information is the cover. And at the head of the title, this is the title. And notice that they don't transcribe NOAA and then give celebrating 200 years of science, service, and stewardship in another title, right? As a remainder or a subtitle. That just doesn't make sense. It grammatically hangs together. So I've shown you the example in the 245, and please do notice that most of our examples, we are not giving you complete 245 and 246 fields, because otherwise it would just be too many words on these screens. So often we'll leave off the period at the end too. We just aren't going to give you all that extra information. Now here's an example of a variant in MARC field 246, 3 blank. And this is when you are giving a permutation of the title. It may be considered, somebody may search under this title under what NOAA, the acronym, means, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And then alternately, if you really thought someone would search under celebrating 200 years, you could give the words. But the cataloging agency didn't feel that it was important to do so. And I would agree, I think it's a little bit too much, because they're also giving a popular title. And here's an example of how to give a popular title. Now, I didn't show you, but actually, if you click on the ebook, you will see this NOAA 200th anniversary book and a little emblem. It's kind of on the cover or elsewhere in the book. And apparently, the government agency that cataloged it knew that it was also known as this. So this is great. So if your users know a book, like they come in and they call something the red book or the green book, you could say also known as and give a note in 246 subfield I, also known as colon, and then the title that that book is known by. Notice that the indicators in 246 field, the variant title field, is 1 blank. If you're going to use the subfield I, you should use 1 blank. So again, you can see how these variant titles are a judgment call. And then I've given you an example for a number that is displayed as a word in a title proper. 6 Plays for Children by Orand Harris up on the right part of your screen. And typically, you do not need to give a variant if a word if a number is shown as a word when you transcribe that. Not unless you felt like someone really would search under the Arabic numeral 6. So that's not that likely. And here's just a few for you to think about. How a portion of title recorded as variant title is really your judgment call. Also at the bottom is a Library of Congress LCPCC policy statement example that shows you how you can give a corrected title using that same variant title form, 246 1 blank, subfield I, corrected title. And honestly, if the corrected part of the title was about word 75 because you had a long title, or it was buried in the other title, you do not need to even give this. You can just simply give a note and say, a note about a misspelled word in the title. So it's only give this variant title if it's important for access. And since a NEV mechanism, that's important for access. It's right in the first 5 words. Yes, give the variant. So in these 3 examples, Adam, Newborn and Perfect, the Renaissance Promise of Eternity, the title proper, Adam, Newborn and Perfect, it doesn't really tell you what they're going to talk about. They're going to talk about the Renaissance. So yeah, that's a perfect example of you're probably going to need a variant title. And you don't want to actually record Adam and then Newborn and Perfect in other title, right? So a lot of grammar really is very important. And if another cataloging agency recorded a title and you would not have recorded that way, the way to deal with it is add variants. And that also will help prevent duplicate records, which we would all love, wouldn't we? So how to read Nancy is fun. I grew up reading Nancy. So the elements of comics and 3 easy panels. Well, I knew what Nancy was when I saw this picture. But younger people probably don't know who Nancy is. So the elements of comics and 3 easy panels is a great variant title. And then here's one of our older government documents. And to even verify that the United Arab Republic, Egypt, was the title proper, I had to look elsewhere in the book. And it verifies it on actually the back cover. But I would never give this title as United Arabic Republic and then colon, other title, Egypt. I would just supply a comma, United Arab Republic, comma, Egypt, or even no comma. However, I would give a variant for this. I would give Egypt because this is kind of like a tourist manual, and it would be helpful for people. They wouldn't look for a tourist manual under United Arab Republic. They would look for Egypt. So these are just things for you to think about. And one more for books. Consider the grammar. So if a title consists solely of the name of an agent, record the name as the title. However, this title is Gene Stratton Porter, author and naturalist. And it's very clear from this design that author and naturalist is probably other title, right? Again, it's a judgment call. So if the title is Gene Stratton Porter, and that should be space colon space, author and naturalist, then the variant can be title appears on item as Gene Stratton Porter, comma, author and naturalist. And so that will help you find this both ways. It will prevent duplicate records. And if you were cataloging this for the first time, you could just say, well, author and naturalist, that's really an apposition to Gene Stratton Porter. These are noun phrases side by side, like my colleague Thomas. So colleague and Thomas are two nouns that have equivalent meaning. So if I thought of Gene Stratton Porter, author and naturalist, as two noun phrases with that equivalent meaning, then I could record them as the title proper with the comma and then give the variant, which I would do because otherwise we'll have duplicate records. We don't want that.
All right, so now I get to talk about some introductory words and phrases, and you'll notice I got two beautiful pictures of title screens there. It's important to note that for when cataloging resources that consist of moving images, you are supposed to use the title screen or screens, title frame, or frames as the chief source of information. Now, I will have examples later on in this presentation where that is not the case, and I do realize that in a lot of cataloging agencies, they don't necessarily have the resources, either technological or time, to actually view title screens, and there are ways around this. As an alternative, you are allowed to give a disk label title. They prefer the disk label title to the container title because the disk label is affixed to the medium and can't ever go away unless, I guess, complete damage to it. But the container is usually an insert in behind plastic that can be removed, it can get torn or damaged, and get separated from the item. So now on to introductory words and phrases. Here on the left, we have Walt Disney Presents, The Reluctant Dragon. Now, we're instructed in RDA 2.3.1.6. Do not transcribe words that serve as an introduction and are not intended to be part of the title. So in this example, Walt Disney Presents is not intended to be part of the title. It's an introductory phrase. So we record the title as The Reluctant Dragon. And you can give Walt Disney Presents as part of the statement of responsibility in a subfield C. However, you may want to give a variant title where Walt Disney Presents is the first part of the title if you think that someone might be looking for it in that way. Now on the right, we have a separate example where the introductory words are actually connected to the title grammatically. So Ken Murray's Bill and Coo. And in this case, Ken Murray is connected to the title with the possessive, so we actually do include those words as part of the title proper. But we will also give a variant title for a portion of title just beginning with Bill and Coo. Now another case where we use and see variant titles is with Arabic numbers. So on our example on the left, 13 going on 30. The LC, PCC, PS for recording variant titles for Arabic numbers excluding dates instructs us that we are to make a variant title substituting the corresponding spelled out form of the number in the language of the title proper. if it is thought that some users might reasonably expect that the form was spelled out in words in the source. So imagine a user in this case that knows that they want to find 13 going on 30. They're looking in your OPAC to find if the library owns this resource. They may not know that 13 and 30 on the resource are in numbers as opposed to being spelled out in words. So it's important for access that we give a variant spelling out 13 and 30 so that the user may be able to find this resource either way they are likely to search it. And this is an example where we took the title from the disk label, and OLAC best practices say when we take the title from anywhere other than the title screens to always indicate that we did so. Now the example on the right is a little more interesting in my opinion. So we have too fast, too furious with the number 2. So we want to give the variant of the number 2 spelled as a word, TWO, in the case that someone might look for it like that, and that's the spirit of the instruction. But in this case, really, to read this in English, we actually mean the TOO variant of the word to. So I decided that it would be appropriate to give another variant with it spelled TOO. And then also, since this is the second movie in the Fast and Furious franchise, it's likely that users may know this as Fast and the Furious 2 without knowing that its actual title is Too Fast, Too Furious. Continuing on with numbers, remember in the last slide I stated that the corresponding spelled out form of the number should be in the language of the title proper. So here's a case where we see the title screen is 12, but the resource is in Russian. So the proper way to give a variant title for this would be to give the spelled out version of the number 12 in Russian, which I've done in the paired fields there in the first and second 246. Now, if your users are mostly English-speaking users and maybe they don't know the word for Russian, which I certainly didn't until I looked it up to give this variant title, then I would also give a 246 in the English spelling in case they were looking for it this way. Now, symbols, there are various instructions on how to deal with signs and symbols. In RDA 1.7.5, we're instructed that we should replace a symbol or other character that cannot be reproduced with a description of the symbol and indicate that this description was taken from outside the resource. Normally how we do this is in square brackets. There's also a rather large LC-PCC policy statement on signs and symbols. And there's also a policy statement on Greek or other non-Latin script letters, and that's policy statement for 1.4. And in that, we're instructed to Romanize all occurrences of Greek and non-Latin script letters. And we may also give the non-Latin form. So that's exactly what we did in the case of the movie Pi. The title consists solely of the symbol pi. So the 245 we record as pi, spelled out, the Romanized form, in square brackets, indicating that we took it from outside the resource. And then we are optionally allowed to add the symbol as a variant title, which we did in the 246. And then a note indicating that the title consists solely of the mathematical symbol for pi.
This is Andrea again, and you probably have titles in your library's collection with I heart and the symbol of a heart. And just a note, if you feel like your users might search under that symbol as I love instead of I heart, you could actually add 2 variants for that with those spelled out words. So the symbol for heart would be displayed in the title proper, just like Thomas has displayed the symbol for pi. Now, some special scenarios. So this is a collective title. So a collective title is a title that stands in for the entire resource. So this title contains 2 works. actually a collection of Mary Webb's poems plus a collection of her nature essays, which actually has its own title, The Spring of Joy. So this is a little bit difficult, and I showed you what the cataloging records show in OCLC connection when you return the indexes, because people were a little confused about how to record this. So I gave you the proper way to record a collective title of this sort when there is a specific title within the collective title. If you chose not to record the title this way, in the 245, 10 poems, and then you use a semicolon because you're going to have another title with a and as a conjunctive, subfield B and comma. You capitalize the Spring of Joy, which you can see it's not capitalized in the index of titles to the left. And then you add an access point for the title that's within the title. And that access point is in a 740 field. And 740 fields are for analytical entries. In other words, there are titles within the title. And you want to give access, but you do not want to give authorized access points. So Spring of Joy is an access point. However, notice it's not a named title access point. One way you can get around that is by adding a named title access point with the 700 field. And if you do that, you want to use 1, 2, especially that second indicator 2, which means this is contained within the work. You may or may not, it's what you choose to do, include the subfield I note, which is a relationship designator, container of work, colon, and then you have the name Mary Webb, and then her additional title that's within this work. So none of these titles that were in, this is an old title that is available in HathiTrust, and this was never cataloged this way. This would be an appropriate way to catalog this. If you didn't want to catalog it this way, another way you could do it is just add at least a 246 for Spring of Joy as portion of title. I mean, this is probably the best way, but not everyone can afford to do it or can look up all these fields. So what's more important, providing access to your users or doing everything perfectly? Let's provide access to our users. So even if you recorded this title as just Poems and the Spring of Joy, I would say at least capitalize the Spring of Joy and at least add a 246 Spring of Joy. And that would be better than not having a variant title at all. That one was kind of a tough one.
Okay, so another special scenario is franchise titles. And what do I mean when I say franchise? So a franchise are often related media that often use a common title and share a fictional universe. And they're often transmedia. They span books, films, games, etc. Some of these might be Lord of the Rings or Hunger Games. And so the OLAC best practices for handling franchise titles, and this actually comes from their video game cataloging manual, but it's transitioned over into other media and will probably be part of the updated DVD and Blu-ray cataloging best practices guide when that gets updated, is to record the franchise title and the number and or specific title as part of the title proper, 245 subfield A, adding a colon for clarity. Do not put a space in front of the colon because it's not ISBD punctuation. Only record a title as other title information if it is clearly secondary to the title information and is not necessary to distinguish the title from other titles in the franchise. We've got 2 examples of this on the next slide. So here we go. We've got Disney Pirates of the Caribbean. And so Disney there is an introductory word, so we don't include that as part of the title. So Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Men Tell No Tales. So Pirates of the Caribbean is the franchise, and Dead Men Tell No Tales is integral to the title. So we transcribe the title as Pirates of the Caribbean, colon, space, Dead Men Tell No Tales, and make sure to give a 24630 part of title for Dead Men Tell No Tales. And you could also indicate that you see Disney at the head of title. You could also even give a variant title with Disney as the first word if you thought people would be looking for that that way. And on the bottom, I have X-Men Days of Future Past. Now, I have 3 examples here of how you might encounter this title. Only the first is considered best practice. Days of Future Past is not a subtitle. It's integral to the title of this film. Nor is it a part title. It is not a smaller part of a title called X-Men. X-Men is the franchise title.
Now we're going to show you a few alternative titles. An alternative title is defined as the second part of a title proper that consists of 2 parts, each of which has a form of an independent title, joined by words such as or its equivalent in another language. And this definition and other definitions will be on that handout. So, in this case, this title, All Around the House or How to Make Homes Happy, is all part of the title proper. And that's because RDA instructions say record an alternative title as part of the title proper. So 245, subfield A, All Around the House, and I need to point out that there is no subfield B because it's all part of the title proper. But however, you do add the commas before and after that conjunction or, and you capitalize the alternative title, How to Make Homes Happy. And it's a best practice to add a variant, 24630, How to Make Homes Happy. Now, if this had variant like a running title, for example, you can use your options for second indicator in MARC field 246, and a running title would be second indicator 7, and you could give the appropriate running title. So I'm just giving this as an example. This didn't have a running title. Notice this is a good example too of when an author has this author of motherly tales, etc. And often in RDA we're recording all that additional information, but we still don't record this kind of advertisement.
So here's an example of an alternative title for a motion picture. We have School for Scoundrels or How to Win Without Actually Cheating. In this example, we do exactly the same thing that we do for books. So we record all of this as part of the title proper and give a part title for the second half of the title. This is a good example also of the fact that sometimes a title for a motion picture can span multiple title screens. So we have School for Scoundrels on one screen, and then it's connected by the conjunction or on the second title, or How to Win Without Actually Cheating.
Now here's some examples of parallel titles. And in RDA, you can take a parallel title, so a title in another language, and sometimes there's more than just one other parallel title. You can take it from any source within the resource itself. It could be an added title page. It could be a book that's inverted or ket besh, and you have the first part of the book is in English. You invert it, and it's upside down. You read it in French, for example. This is a Canadian example. It's a good example because if you search this in WorldCat or Connection, you will see that the Canadian cataloging agency actually missed the fact that this was originally put in with cataloging and publication data with just our story and Notre Histoire as part of the title. In actuality, according to their cataloging practices, they record the entire logo up there for their Parks Canada 1911 to 2011, 100 Years Our Story. That is their practice. They record that. That's fine if they do. In RDA, we're encouraged to accept what other cataloging agencies do, but we want to make sure that the variants are there for how our users can find this. And so here's the variants, the 246.11, and the first indicator 1 means just make a note that this is a parallel title. So you do not have to have first indicator 1. You could have first indicator 3 if you don't want a note. And the note would say parallel title. So Parks Canada here is written out in French, right? So that's the parallel title. And usually you give all of the parallel title. And then the other variant, which is 246.3 blank, is our story. You use the equal sign in MARC to say that the next parallel title is coming. And then that parallel title to our story is no trace for. So there's a couple different ways you could do this, and that's why the records in connection were kind of confusing. But as long as you have the variants, then you provide your users access. Here's another example of a parallel title. So this work has an added title page. And in AACR2 cataloging, which was perfectly fine, the OPAC would read Welsh folktales by the author, etc. It would only give the English form, and then with a note saying that there was an added title page for the Welsh. Actually, this book is in English and Welsh, but to our users, the Welsh was not very useful, right? So in RDA, however, we could record everything. And I've given you the example of how you can record everything. You do keep the statements of responsibilities for parallel titles with the title proper if you choose to record them that way. So you can record the two parallel titles and one statement of responsibility. That's another decision you could make. But this is recording it in full. It's a good practice. Again, the parallel title variant would be 246.1.1 for the Welsh. And you can also use 246.1.5, 5 meaning added title page, and do that. But I would not do them both. So that's a decision for you. The 246.1.5 would be a good one if you didn't want to update the AACR2 cataloging, right?
All right, so parallel titles for DVDs, and man, are there a lot. So in this example of Pan's Labyrinth, the actual title screen has the title in the original Spanish language. I'm not going to pretend to know how to pronounce it because I would just butcher it. But we see there in that top screenshot that we have a parallel title from the optional English subtitles. And that's something that's really interesting with RDA that we couldn't do with AACR2, is that a parallel title can be taken from anywhere within the resource, including the optional subtitles. So, and we see also on the disc label there that Pan's Labyrinth is written in English. This is the American release of the DVD, so they chose the American or English title for their disc label. So there are many ways that we can record this, and all of them are appropriate. So in the first case, we can treat it as if Pan's Labyrinth is not a parallel title because it's in the optional English subtitles, and just give the Spanish title in the 245. And then if we thought it was needed for access, which in this case I would say it definitely is, give the title on the disc label in English subtitles as Pan's Labyrinth. We could also treat Pan's Labyrinth as a parallel title, as in the second example there, or if we don't have the resources to be able to look and see that the title screen is actually in Spanish, we might have to record the English title in the 245 and note that the title is from the disc label. Note that this does limit access for those who may know the film by the Spanish title. And the OLAC best practice recommendation is to make a note for the source of the parallel title proper if it is taken from a different source than the title proper. So this opens a can of worms. So most of our DVD titles have multiple subtitle options. So how many do we record as parallel titles? Do we record any as parallel titles? And where does it stop? So this is a case where we use cataloger's judgment to decide what is helpful for our users. If we have a large Spanish-speaking population or French-speaking population or whatever, we may want to add those parallel titles from the optional subtitles if we feel that our users would be able to find it under that title. But note here that we also give the 500 note indicating where the parallel titles came from. And this is also an example of multiple parallel titles where we can just string them along, equal sign after equal sign in the subfield B.
Now we have more examples of collective titles. A collective title is a title proper that is an inclusive title for a resource that contains also separately titled component parts. So here's your example for one-act plays, and then the separate parts are the parts that are listed. They look like table of contents too, doesn't it? So actually, the RDA instructions say to record collective titles and titles of individual contents as appropriate to the type of description. So you do have to be careful. Usually with books, we're cataloging with a comprehensive description, but if you're doing an analytical description, there are some slight differences in cataloging. So just be aware of that. And an analytical description would be like when you catalog a special issue of a journal or of an archive, part of an archive. So here's your comprehensive description. You record the collective title. The title of the individual contents, however, are recorded if they are considered important, and they may not be. Most of the time we record them. And then we record related works, which is a core element, but only for Library of Congress for compilations. And the way we record these works that are the plays, the rest cure, and Between the Soup, is to give a 505 contents note. That's one option. Or to give, and then in addition, give an analytical authorized access point for the predominant or first work in the compilation if substantial. So this is your decision. And then they give you some guidance too in the policy statements. Do not apply to anthologies of poetry. You don't want to have a table of contents for all the poems. Of course, you could make an exception if you had a long epic poem as part of the compilation. And here's how you would do this. 245 for one-act plays, 505, the rest cure. Now you could do an enhanced 505 and then code these titles with 50500, and then the titles would be subfill T. You can also add 740s, and these would be on access points but not authorized, and they're for the analytic titles, the titles within the title. That's why it's 74002, second indicator 2. That's important. That provides a browse title access, and the 505 with the subfill Ts would usually provide keyword title access for the individual play titles. If you really want best access, then you can add the 70012 for this name, this author, and this title, which is contained within the work. Often this is not done unless you felt like that title was really important. And then I give you an example of the enhanced contents. That's optional. What does LC prefer? Well, to save themselves some time. So they usually just give a 505. Sometimes they enhance it. And then they also add at least one access point. I usually add access points for most of the plays if they're like 3, 4, or 5, but not for 8 or 9. And here's another collective title. What's interesting about this was this is the cover, and it has the individual plays, but the title page does not show the individual plays. The title page just says 4 Irish Rebel Plays. Here's the actual cataloging in OCLC. You'll notice again 4, they don't do a variant with the Arabic number 4. You could if you wanted to. You could identify the James Moran, who's the editor, also as a compiler if you wanted to. But notice the 505. Now, all these different plays are by a different author. So if you wanted to, then you could supply those in a 700 name, title, access point for each one of those. Again, that's a lot of work, so not everyone would do it. But if you had a high school that was reading one of those plays, boy, you'd want that access on your record. And you can go in and edit later. And here's what they look like. So you see below 70012 and first author of When the Dawn Has Come, etc. So hopefully this is a good example of how you can, improve the access when it's important, even if it's important later. Maybe you never even knew this was important until someone comes in and says, we're reading this for class. Notice that we usually don't create an authority record to support these individual contents, short stories, that kind of thing, even if they're kind of novelettes. That's not that typical.
So here's an example of a collective title for a DVD. And for DVDs, it's highly unlikely that you will find a collective title to be on the title screens or even on disc labels. So your container is typically your best choice. And we can do that because RDA 2.2.2.3 says use as the preferred source of information the first applicable source with a formally presented collective title. In our case, this is the cover here, Wartime Comedies, and we can give two variants of the collective title. If you see, you can't see it very well, but way up in the proof of purchase above the UPC, we have another collective title that may be helpful for folks. It's definitely a good one, 8-movie Wartime Comedy Collection. And then also the container spine has a separate title that we could has a subtitle to the 8-movie collection. So we also are going to give a 505 contents note for the individual titles contained within this collection. And you can see the disc labels there is where I took the titles for the individual titles.
Those are some great movies, great examples, Thomas. So what do you do when the manifestation, the resource that you can access or is physically published, lacks a collective title? So maybe it's something from Shakespeare and it just says, you know, Hamlet and Macbeth. That's it. There's no collective title. So if the type of description is a comprehensive description and the manifestation lacks a collective title, then RDA instructs us to record the titles proper of the parts as they appear on the source of information for the manifestation as a whole. And so since people usually know who Jane Austen is, I gave you an example of some of her works, Northanger Abbey, Lady Susan, The Watson, and Sanditon. And this is how you would use ISBD punctuation, the International Standard Punctuation, to separate out these individual titles. And then here's the title page, and here is how you can do some of the MARC variant titles. Normally, we don't add 246 variant titles. I show you the coding in field 245. Notice subfield B comes after a semicolon, and then you just list whatever your next title part is. In this case, Lady Susan. Make sure you capitalize each one of these titles. And then the best access, according to the policy statements, is to add a 740.02 for these parts, and then or a 700.12. And that gives even better access when you say this work contains Jane Austen, Lady Susan, or Jane Austen, the Watsons, excuse me. So again, it's optional, but you wouldn't have to add a 740 or a 700 for each one of them. The only one that is actually core for Library of Congress is the first or predominant one in the collection. So these are kind of difficult, I think. They're not easy at all. But just be aware that you do not give a preferred title. So you should not have a 240 on this record, because that would be incorrect to say that all of these works are represented by Northanger Abbey, for example. And then here's a collective title, but it's got The Raven by Edgar Allan. It's a non-collective title. There's no title that represents the resource as a whole. Instead, you have The Raven, you have The Courtship of Miles Standish, and you have Snowbound, and they're all by different authors. Here's the 245 field with the example. Because these stand apart, they're not by the same author, the International Standard Bibliographic Description punctuation is a period. You separate these out by period, and you record the statements of responsibility with the titles themselves. Now, this is not ideal, and this is not easily searched in our catalogs. So in this case, if any of these were important to you at all, I would definitely encourage you to add a 505, enhance it if possible, and 700.12s for every single one of them. All the analytical entries. And then honestly, probably The Courtship of Miles Standish might be pretty prominent, or you might consider it prominent. I would add that, but I would also add Snowbound. I would add all three of these if possible. Remember, they don't have to be authorized. And you can also just add them as 740 if you think your users don't really care about the author. If all they're going to look up is Courtship of Miles Standish, add a 740. That's fine.
Okay, and here's an example of a manifestation lacking a collective title for a DVD. So here is the container. Like I said, you're usually for a collective title or for a non-collective title. In this case, aren't going to find that on the title screens themselves. So we see at the top triple feature. Well, that's not really acceptable as a collective title. So in this case, we have to take the titles of the individual works that make up this collection as the 245. And we make sure to give access to each of the titles individually as well. And also on this example, we might consider the text on the back of the cover that stands out. That's actually a pretty decent collective title, so we may want to give that as a variant if people are likely to search under Trailblazers, 3 Rough and Ready Randolph Scott Westerns. It's certainly more descriptive than just giving the titles of the individual films.
Now, we want to share with you that you can email us your questions, right? But we also have some, and we will share some definitions of these titles we talked about today. We know that not all of you have access, so we'll share this. These are the actual instructions for alternative, parallel, other title, for example. And then we also want to point out, let's get this up here, what some of the policy statements look like. And in RDA, they're accessible. They're freely accessible. And what you need to do is go to the Accessing Library of Congress Program for Cooperative Cataloging Policy Statements. And it explains that you go to the RDA toolkit, and then you have access, all of you have access to the toolkit policy statements here. These are free. So, and when we look up variant titles down here, it's 2.3. This is what it's going to look like, but there's lots more information here. There's all the examples. So lots more examples than we can show you in 1 hour. Are there any questions?
Andrea and Thomas, I just wanted to thank you. And we do have one question in the chat box, which is, what does the term running title mean?
Oh, okay, sorry. We stopped sharing our screen. Let's share it again. This is a good time to show you OCLC bibliographic formats, because they usually have a pretty good example. So here's the MARC 246 field variant form of title. Here's running title. So second indicator 7 is used for running title. Usually when you actually look down at the examples, they'll give you an example that makes sense. But basically, if you were to look in, and let me just see if I can pull up a book here. If you were to, say, pull up a Hathi Trust record or just any old book that you actually have it, and we're in this book, and then when you go to any page here, a running title would be a title that is displayed on every page or every other page, either at the top or at the bottom. And so something that would be typical is like the 9/11 report that came out from the government. Probably that's not the official name at all. It's a popular name, but it could be a running title name and provide great access. Any other questions?
I don't see any other questions. I'm going to go ahead and have Lisa stop our recording, and I'm going to go ahead and share the LEU certificate.